Today's presenters are Clive Chambers and Sophia Singh. Both are Washington Hospital's care coordinators. Clive is a registered nurse. He also obtained his state-registered nursing and registered mental health nursing in England. Clive joined Washington Hospital 28 years ago. Sophia earned her Master's of Social Work from Cal State East Bay and joined Washington Hospital 4 years ago. Our care coordinator's primary role is to do psychiatric evaluations in the emergency room and main hospital. Care coordinators are a valuable resource at the hospital.
Primarily, our contact with caregivers were usually related to people with mental illness, like schizophrenia, parents of people with schizophrenia, and some of the autistic spectrum disorders. But as for myself, being a part of the baby boom generation, nearly all of us are going to be involved in some caregiving role at some time in our lives. I certainly was there during the last 3 years when a family member of mine slowly developed Alzheimer's disease, and we slowly lost the vibrancy in the person that she was. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about fatigue and depression, and I find it probably easier to do a little bit of storytelling here. And the people in the story we are going to be using are Molly and her husband, John, Bob and Barbara, husband and wife, and their son, Dominic. We're also going to take it through 2 generations of caregiving, if you will. Okay, Bob and his wife, Barbara, felt they had started their family too young. You know, when young people fall in love and think everything will take care of itself. But as individuals, they'd worked very hard, and Barbara hoped that sometime after her kids grew up that she'd be able to go back to school or back to college and finish her education. She was concerned that she had been a disappointment to her mother, and sometimes those feelings never go away. They had realized they wouldn't be able to afford a house in the Bay Area because, as you all know, housing is incredibly expensive. And even with cutting back, their finances remained tight. Barbara and Bob knew that there was some history of mental illness in the family, and sometimes there's a lot of denial. And they assumed and hoped that their family would dodge the bullet of mental illness. But by the time their son Dominic turned 17, they noticed he would not get up in the morning or get ready for school. He stopped associating with his friends, which was a big sign. He would not shower, which is not uncommon with early teenage years, but they noticed he was getting very suspicious, and he felt the TV programs were referring to him. So he would cover up the television in his room and then started covering up the televisions in all the house. And can we imagine how frightening this must have been for Dominic? And then they eventually noticed that Dominic was having conversations with himself. Within a year, their lives had changed very dramatically, and their hopes that they had for their lives and for Dominic's seemed a little less bright. They were able to get Dominic in to see a therapist and a psychiatrist, and sometimes the earlier you're able to start that intervention, the better the outcomes. Unfortunately, with some of the psychiatric, the talk therapy is very useful, but the main line of attack are the psychiatric medications. And usually there's often much issues with medication compliance because none of us like to feel less energized than the energy we have. And also the other side effect of some of those medications is weight gain and some of the metabolic syndromes which come with that. And as the case of Dominic, they started noticing that he was developing some of the early signs of diabetes. But in any case, Dominic wasn't staying on his medications. And so Barbara was able to contact the National Association of Mental Health, and they offer a lot of support to the family, and they got Dominic involved in the peer support group. And just working with them, they saw a great improvement with Dominic. Barbara's mother, Molly, was a really wonderful lady. She was a retired high school teacher and lived across town in Niles. Any Niles livers? Anyone lives in Niles here? Yay for us, okay. She was an extremely tough lady with a wicked sense of humor. She was starting to develop problems with her diabetes and blood pressure, and in recent years, she had not been taking care of herself as well as other people thought she should be. She'd been taking care of her husband, John, who unfortunately had started showing the early signs of Alzheimer's disease. Their daughter, Barbara, helped as much as she could, but having a family or 2 kids, struggling financially, she was in a very stressful situation. Molly, on the other hand, Molly had other kids who weren't as involved as Molly, and Molly was, in fact, the stepdaughter of John, and his own children weren't as involved as he was. Molly had been an avid reader and would go to yoga and mindfulness, and was a founding member of the book club, which she formed with her girlfriends. But she had thrown her whole being into caring for John as his physical needs became greater. And he started wandering sometimes, and actually got lost once, had to be brought home by the police. And sometimes would become combative, especially in the evenings when he showed some symptoms of sundowning. And having just lived through some of that with my own mother-in-law, I know how difficult that is. His recent memory became less and less, and eventually became absent. But he would remember things from years ago. He had started to become incontinent and had fallen several times. Probably the hardest thing for Molly was the fact that he couldn't remember her name. And even though Molly knew that he couldn't help it, it still hurt. And I know in the case of our family, the caregiving sister was the one person's name that my mother-in-law couldn't remember. And as I say, Molly knew he couldn't help it, but she still felt some pain. He became confused at night, and Molly began feeling that if she only did more, things would get better, or at least wouldn't deteriorate as fast. Her daughter, Molly, felt that Molly was beginning to lose herself because she was no longer taking time for herself. Molly was showing the symptoms of fatigue and depression. She started having a lot of problems with sleep. She started feeling down her mood. She stopped engaging with her friends, and she even stopped reading, which had been her biggest escape. And frankly, some of that was because Molly no longer had time, because all her energy was taken up in giving care to John. She started complaining of having no energy. She was becoming overwhelmed and started feeling hopeless. She gained a lot of weight, often eating things that Molly never would have eaten, because she was, in former years, someone very fitness conscious. And initially gained a lot of comfort from eating those foods, but as time went on, she wasn't getting comfort from that, but it had an effect on her blood sugar, which started getting out of control. Molly was told by her doctor, unless she lose some weight, the blood sugar was affecting her eyesight, and she started getting some numbness in her feet and legs, some peripheral neuropathy. She was often very irritable with her daughter, Barbara, who was the only one of her children who was actually helping, despite Molly's, besides John not being her biological father, Molly was always there, or tried to be. She even found herself thinking what a relief it would be if she wasn't alive anymore. And you know, I think many caregivers get to that place. And she even had a fleeting thought of suicide. but her religious beliefs were pretty strong. And, we don't like to think about suicide, but since this class has started, 4, 6, 7 people have committed suicide in the United States because a suicide occurs about every 12 minutes. So the importance of taking care of yourself and the things that we've learned and will learn in this series will be very helpful. As I say, Barbara's religious beliefs were strong and she was okay in that area. So we looked at the classic signs of depression, which for some months Molly would not admit to. She would ask if she was not able, she asked herself if she wasn't able to care for her husband, then who would be able to care for him? And that nobody could do it as well as she could. Molly was finding it increasingly difficult to concentrate. And her daughter was now losing time from work trying to help her mother and her stepfather. And her absence from her own home was beginning to impact her household and was causing some marital discord because there's only so much of Barbara to go around and everybody wanted a piece of that. So just like Molly was giving all of herself caretaking, the next generation, Barbara found herself in the same place. So here we see the classic symptoms of care fatigue, which led to depression. The good news with depression now is that it's infinitely treatable in nearly all cases. There's an old term that is not so popular right now, or not so common right now, in that we used to break depression down into the endogenous, which is the depression coming from within, and the reactive, which was depression which came as a result of a situation. And in this instance, the situation was her depression, I think, the genesis was one of fatigue and caregiving fatigue. So the good news was Molly's physician was an old school doctor who continued to spend time with his patients. And for Molly, he was more like a family friend. And he was able to discuss medications with Molly. And eventually Molly agreed to try one of the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the SSRIs. And the medications in that group include Prozac, Celexa, Zoloft, and Lexapro. And so Molly was started on a fairly low dose, and then the doses were increased weekly for 3 weeks. For the first few days, Molly felt jittery from some of the side effects of this group of medication, but those side effects gradually subsided by day 7. Molly's doctor had also told her that the majority of the people who take this group of medications take them in the morning, or else it causes some problems with sleep. But 20% of the people are just the opposite. So sometimes there's a little bit of trial and error there. Her doctor also, which is a great thing, had also consulted with Molly's other 2 physicians to make sure that the medications she was taking, there was no bad interactions between the medications, because one of Molly's medications happened to be a blood thinner. One of the good things which is happening now with this hospital, for example, we're using Epic, which the physicians have the ability to see what the other doctors are prescribing. And I think we all here have access to our own medical records online, which is really a good thing. So Molly, with these medications for the first 2 weeks, Molly's family really didn't see much improvement, but there was a glimmer of improvement by week 3 and much improvement by week 5. Molly was also doing some talk therapy, but the biggest improvement came, and you could see it in Molly, was she was able to talk about, to de-stress herself by talking. She was able to talk about her fears, which involved her finances, her own health, and a lot about the things that she had hoped she and John would have been able to achieve in their golden years, their travel and all the other things that they wanted to do. And so Unfortunately, they were not able to do as much of that as they wanted. She also worried a lot about her daughter Molly and her circumstances, and her grandson Dominic. She also thought about her own mortality. She was able to avail herself of many of the supports that you are hearing about tonight and in this series, and she got a lot of information and support from the Alzheimer's Association. Molly was actually able to ask her other children to help, and the biological children of John, and two of them did respond. They hired a caregiver who came in 2 nights and 2 days a week to just give Molly a break, to spend some time for herself. She also had, there are companies who find care homes for people, and she was able to contact one of those who was very helpful in arranging some respite care for John and Molly, because the house had fallen into some disrepair, and Molly was able to get some of the much needed maintenance done for that period when John was in the respite care. She was able to reconnect with a book club and was able to dedicate some time for herself without feeling that she had neglected John. Occasionally you would hear that wit for which Molly had been known, and we hadn't seen Molly laugh in a long time, and laughter is really, really good medicine. This also had a knock-on improvement in Bob and Barbara's household, because as Molly felt better, Barbara was less worried about her, and things started to improve there too, and some of that, their marriage actually became better. Unfortunately, 11 months later, John died, but prior to that, the palliative care had been involved, and the social worker had worked wonders in getting the family together. All the kids who weren't often on the same page became involved. And when John died, he had wanted to die in the home, and they didn't call an ambulance, and showed some respect for the advanced healthcare directives which he had filled out years earlier. And dying can so often be really, really difficult time getting families on the same page. Molly, some of the thoughts which Molly had, she'd wish she'd obtained long-term care insurance years ago when it had been offered through her job. I would like to bring Sophia Singh up to finish this presentation, and thank you very much.
So for the focus of this presentation was on fatigue and depression for someone providing care for persons with Alzheimer's. However, depression and fatigue can impact caregivers who are providing care for anyone that has persistent and serious medical or psychiatric conditions. So we hope that the education and information provided will help lighten some of the load. So these are just some of the statistics that we have been able to gather. So for caregivers, 65.7 million informal and family caregivers provide care to someone who is ill, disabled, or aged in the U.S. 52 million caregivers, which is 1 out of every 5 households, are involved in caregiving to persons aged 18 and over. 43.5 million caregivers provide care for someone who are aged 50 plus, and 14.9 million care for someone who has Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. Even most of the severely disabled older persons living in the community, about 2/3 rely solely on caregivers or on family members and other informal help, often resulting in great strain for the family caregivers. Next slide is focused on mental health. So approximately 1 in 5 adults in the U.S., which is about 43.7 million, or 18.6%, experience mental health illness in a given year. Approximately 1 in 25 adults in the U.S., or about 13.6 million, or 4.1%, experience a serious mental illness in a given year that substantially interferes with or limits one or more major life activities. So as an example, in Molly's case, which was reading, going to the book club, going to the health club, 6.9% of adults in the US, so about 16 million, at least has had at least one major depressive episode in the past year. 18.1% of adults in the US experience an anxiety disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and specific phobias. So among the 20.7 million adults in the US who experience substance abuse disorder, 40.7% or 8.4 million adults had a co-occurring mental illness. Sometimes in terms of coping or learning how to cope, caregivers do turn into substance abuse, whether it be alcohol or smoking, well, in this case, marijuana, and the increase or the intake of it increases. We hope that the information that we provide today within the series and a series that continues to come helps lighten up some of the load, helps you guys get a better insight to the resources that are available in the community. Thank you so much for coming out here and taking the time to come to Washington Hospital and get the education.
Thank you.